right. So in this video, I wanted to talk about how valuations work in football, how transfer valuations work. It has been one of the biggest debates online by football fans, and the reason for it is because uh, Arsenal just bought Declan Rice for 105 million pounds, which is a lot of money in any context. The fact that you pay that much money for a football player, not much Arsenal. I mean, that's the record for an English player, and is the record amount that Arsenal has paid for any player. But the question now is he worth that amount, right? Because the debate among football fans, Arsenal fans, and other um, rival fans, team fans, has been, wait a minute, it's not worth that amount, and you have Arsenal fans that don't think um, Declan Rice is worth 105 million pounds. But the question is, I mean, when we say somebody worth that money, what are we actually talking about? Because for most people that are making these conclusions, they would never be in a position to spend £1 million, $1 million on a player, talk less of $100 million. So the market that we are operating on is totally different. It's almost like asking a couple of years ago when Facebook bought WhatsApp for 20 billion dollars. That was what Facebook paid for WhatsApp, and that was probably over 10 years ago now, more or less. And the question at the time that people have been asking is, wait a minute. And I remember at this time that WhatsApp is not worth that much, but obviously with how popular and how much everyone uses WhatsApp all across the globe, it was probably worth more than that. Now, that is the way that I think we should think about football valuation as well, because sometimes it's not like going into a grocery store to buy, you know, vegetables or apples or something like that. There are a bunch of factors that go into evaluating the worth of a football player. And that is what I'm going to talk about in this video quickly. Hopefully it is not too long. So first of all, the first thing that you want to talk about is player performance, right? Like, has the player been good? Obviously, if we're going to apply this question to Declan Rice, over the last couple of years, he's been regarded as one of the best midfield players in the Premier League, which is regarded as one of the best leagues in the world, right? So even though he plays for West Ham, there seems to be a consensus among not just football fans, but also coaches, and he has a reputation of being um, one of the best performing players in his position, right? In his position, he's a midfielder. He has one of the best numbers, statistics in terms of interceptions, in terms of tackles, those kinds of metrics that you'll be looking at for someone that plays in his position. So that is one thing. The other factor that you're going to be looking at is age. So factor number 2, age. Typically, depending on the age of a player, the older you are, the the cheaper, so to speak, you're going to be, especially when you are comparing the age to the quality of the player, which means how good you are, right? So if you have, if Declan Rice is 24 years old. If he were to be 28, 29 years old, right, he would be considerably cheaper than 105 million pounds. The reason for that is, the valuation will be like, wait a minute, is worth, if we can only get him for a couple of years, and his sell-on value will be greatly diminished. But at 24 years old, the thinking will be, hey, he can possibly pay for 8 years until he's 30, 10 years, who knows. But even if he doesn't work out at Arsenal, the thinking will be that, well, it may be moved on and sold for value. Say, for instance, after 3 years, it's a flop. He didn't play well. It didn't work out. In 3 years, he'll be 27. Some other team might find him valuable, and who knows what the market will be at that time. They may go ahead and sell him at 50 million pounds, 60 million pounds at that time. And then Arsenal is going to cut their loss and move on, go buy another player. So that is another factor in that. The third is the position, right? For instance, strikers historically always cost a lot. Midfielders, for whatever reason, the kind of midfielder that Declan Rice is, they have been costing a lot lately. And the reason is because they are being identified as being integral to teams that that are winning. So if you're a defensive midfielder that can do multiple things, which is the kind of person that Declan Rice is big, he's strong, he can tackle, he can run, he can go on runs, he can pass. He's very good at passing. He used to be that midfielders, some certain defensive midfielders before were just there to defend, but that's not just what he does. He does a lot of things, and more importantly, he's a leader. Like he's considered a leader on the team. In fact, most people think that he's going to be the England captain. He plays for the England national team as well. So most people think he's going to be their captain in a couple of years when Harry Kane, who is the current captain, retires, and Harry Kane is about 30 years old. So which means he probably has a couple of years left. And Declan Rice is considered a natural leader, if you will, would be coming in at that point. So that is another factor right there. The position. It is an in-demand position. A lot of Man City that won the title this year. A lot of people think a big reason why they won is because of Rodri, the midfielder in that sits right there. And in fact, Rodri also scored their goal in the Champions League, the only goal that won Man City the Champions League. And if you've been following football, Man City has been chasing to win the Champions League for a very, very long time. Okay, so the next kind of factors again that a team will be thinking about is the contract duration, right? So Declan Rice had 2 years left on his contract. The fact that he's good, is in demand, is at his position, all of that stuff. But he also had 2 years left. So technically it means that West Ham, his team, wouldn't have been in a rush to sell him. So if he had a year left, as an example, to the point where he's going to be running out his contract, then his value is going to diminish significantly. And we can see that with Harry Kane, right, who has 1 year left with his contract at Spurs, Tottenham Spurs, and the same thing with Mbappe, Kylian Mbappe at the PSG. They both have 1 year left. If either Spurs or PSG should sell their respective players, they're not going to get as much money for them as they would if they had more than 1 year left on their contract, right? So the contract duration is quite important. The next is marketability. So, and what this means is, if you are a high-profile football player, again, using the Kylian Mbappe example, any team that it goes to is going to pay whatever transfer fee, whether it's 100 million, 200. I mean, Kylian Mbappe is probably going to go for at least 200 million if somebody were to buy him, 150, 200 million. But because he has a year left, there may be a discount on that. But the reason why teams will pay for him and also pay for big salaries, maybe £500,000 a week for Mbappe, is because of his marketability. Everybody knows, because he's a superstar, he's a world-class player, considered one of the few world-class players. It's almost like if you're buying Lionel Messi, right? You know that he's going to bring a different kind of vibe to your team in terms of support, new fans, people buying the football, the shirts, the jerseys, and the popularity of the team, of the players, and it's just going to change totally, whether from a commercial perspective, and also it could also affect whether or not these games are being carried on TV, because everyone wants to watch Mbappe. It means TV stations are going to carry the games of the team that he plays for, which means it's going to generate more money for the team. So people are going to be, a team is going to be able to, it's going to want to pay more for that in that particular instance. Okay, so now we've talked about marketability, right? Another thing that teams will be looking at is the economic factors. Again, economic factors can be thought of as something that is very it's just very great. And what that means is, if you think about during the pandemic, there were a bunch of clubs that ran into financial trouble because they couldn't because all of the stadiums were closed. There weren't fans going into the stadiums, and they weren't able to generate revenue because of the activity that is around playing games on a weekly basis, right? And because of that, some of them had to sell off their assets at fire sale, at cheap prices and things like that. So if there are those types of economic factors, maybe for whatever reason, there are financial issues with the club, they may be forced to sell their players. An example would be Valencia as an example. I mean, Valencia has been forced the last couple of years to just sell off their best players to kind of like try and plug the different financial holes that they have. And the same thing is with West Ham. West Ham ideally may have wanted to keep Declan Rice, but they are actually in financial straits. They are being watched. They are on the watch list by UEFA, so they're on the financial watch list. So because of that, they want to sell Declan Rice, and that's also why they've been insisting. They've been insisting to have the payments paid in a relatively short period of time, which is something that is unheard of. Okay, the next point is the injury history of the player. If you have a player that's had a bad injury, that's gonna, I mean, inevitably that's gonna affect the valuations, right? So there have been a bunch of players that has happened. An example would be Anthony Martial in Manchester United. He's been injured so many times over the years. He's a very good player, but the injury record is something that's been holding him back. So it's been holding him back in terms of him being able to perform for the team, but it's also been difficult for Manchester to be able to sell him because nobody wants to buy him. It's not going to be cheap. It's on big wages, but nobody's going to be able to have trust and faith in the fact that he's going to be able to keep fit. If you can guarantee that he's going to be fit, people will pay the money to buy him because he's a very good player. And the ninth reason is the demand, right? There's certain positions that have been in demand, like that are in demand, depending on the time, the era of football. Now, I'll give you an example. Now, I said earlier that defensive midfielders are in demand. Another position that's been in demand lately is goalkeepers that are very good football players that can play the ball with their feet, not just goal stoppers or shot stoppers. Go ball playing goalkeepers like Ederson at Manchester City, Alisson at Liverpool, and Andre Onana at Milan, who Manchester United is actually looking to buy. And the reason for that is because they're not just great shot stoppers, but they are also very, very good passers of the ball because contemporary managers, contemporary coaches want to play from the back, want to build up play from the back and pass the ball rather than just have a long kickoff. These goalkeepers are in demand and they're costing a lot of money, and that is a reason why. That is also another factor why that can affect sales. I mean, in this case, Declan Rice is a defensive midfielder. The top teams around the world: Manchester United, Manchester City, Arsenal, Bayern, they are looking for players in this kind of positions, right? And they're willing to pay however much it is. And in this case, Arsenal won. Arsenal was able to convince Declan Rice to come. And this is going to segue into my last reason. The last reason, that affects valuation is the player's desire. Because at the end of the day, a player has to be willing to go to a club. Now, typically what happens is people think that you can just sell, a club can just sell a player. But a club can sell a player only to the extent that the player is willing to go to that club, right? Obviously, most of the time, a player is going to be willing to go because at the end of the day, you want to play, you want to move on. Maybe you're going to be on better wages. It could be a better situation for you. And everybody understands, like, you don't want to be in a club that doesn't want you anymore, right? So, but there are times when some players are not going to move if they don't want to go to a different club because as a buying club, you have to agree with the club that currently owns the registration rights to the player, but also you have to agree a fee with it. I mean, you have to agree the salary with the player. Those are two different contractual agreements that have nothing to do with each other at all. So in the case of Declan Rice, right, if West Ham had agreed with Arsenal, but Declan Rice did not want to go to Arsenal, they would not be able to force him to do it. And the same thing with any other team as well. So a player's desire can determine, desire to go to a particular team can determine the valuation. Because if a player says, I only want to go to this one team, it means the club will be forced to just negotiate with that one team, and that can affect the valuation, right? Because the club knows that they are the only fish in town, and it means there wouldn't really be an opportunity to engage in a bidding war that can drive up prices and things like that. So again, that is another factor that can affect valuation. Well, anyway, those are 10 factors that I've talked about that can affect player valuations in football. And when you are thinking about whether or not a player is worth a certain amount, don't just sit around. You can't know, because at the end of the day, the worth of a player is really reflective of what is worth to both, what that player is worth to both the selling club and the buying club. And you're not going to know if it is worth it. The only time maybe I should rephrase this way. The only time you're going to be able to know if a player is worth it is after a couple of years, whether the player has been successful or the player has not. So an example would be, in Arsenal, for instance, Pepe was bought for £72 million. There's a great consensus that purchase hasn't been successful. So, and then you have someone like Gabriel Martinelli, who was bought for only £5 million or £6 million. I mean, there's no doubt. Like, so far, he has been wildly successful at Arsenal. But anyway, folks, that's all I have. If you like this video, you should like this video and subscribe to this channel. All right. Yeah, and if you have any comments, write them below as well.